The Girl Scouts Rally by Catherine Galt. Chapter 4. When Rosanna finished, Helen gave a sigh of delight. "Rosanna," she said, "it is perfectly beautiful, perfectly beautiful. Shall you have the Webster girls sing that?" "I had not thought of them," confessed Rosanna. "I thought it would be nice for Elise and you, Helen. You both sing so sweetly, and you can both dance, too." "I shall be frightened to death," said Helen, trying to imagine herself on a real little stage. At least on a make-believe stage, with a curtain stretched across Mrs. Horton's or Mrs. Hargrave's parlor. But frightened or not, she was more than pleased that Rosanna had thought of her, and she had no intention of giving up the part. She and Elise commenced to practice on the song, and between them made up the prettiest little dance. Mrs. Culver and Mrs. Hargrave were delighted to play their accompaniments and suggest steps. Of course, they had to be told something of what was going on, but they were very nice and asked no questions. A week later, Rosanna's little play was finished and ready to show Uncle Robert. Rosanna was as nervous as a real playwright when he had to read his lines to a scowly, fault-finding manager. She invited Helen over to spend the night with her so she could attend the meeting. Her grandmother was out to a dinner bridge party, so Rosanna and Helen and Uncle Robert went up to Rosanna's sitting room and prepared to read her play. And if the truth must be told, Uncle Robert prepared to be a little bored. But as Rosanna read on in her pleasant voice, stopping once in a while to explain things, Uncle Robert's expression changed from a look of patient listening to one of amusement, and then to admiration. By the time Rosanna had finished, he was sitting leaning forward in his chair and listening with all his might. He clapped his hands. "Well done, Rosanna," he said heartily. "I am certainly proud of you. Why, if you can do things of this sort at your age, Rosanna, we will have to give you a little help and instruction once in a while." Well, that is a play as is a play. Don't you think so, Helen?" "It is just too beautiful," said Helen with a sigh of rapture. "Just too beautiful. Which is my part, Rosanna?" "I thought you could be the little girl who discovers a lost paper, so the other little Girl Scout's brother will not have to go to prison. That is, if you like the part." "It is the nicest part of all," sighed Helen. "What part are you going to take?" "I didn't think I would take any," said Rosanna. "Oh, you must be in it," cried Helen. "No, Rosanna is right," declared Uncle Robert. "It is her play, you see, and she will have to be sitting out front at all the rehearsals to see that it is being done as she wants it." "That is what I thought," said Rosanna. "But you are going to help with everything, are you not, Uncle Robert?" "Surest thing in the world," declared Uncle Robert heartily. "But as long as this is all about the Girl Scouts, won't you have to show it to your Girl Scout captain or leader before you go on with it?" "Of course," said Rosanna. "Who is she?" asked Uncle Robert carelessly. "Why, you saw her, Uncle Robert," replied Rosanna. "Have you forgotten the dear, sweet little lady who called when I was sick? When we were looking for someone very fierce and large?" "Sure enough," said Uncle Robert, after some thought. If Rosanna had noticed, she would have seen a very queer look in his eyes. He had liked the looks of that young lady himself. "Well, what are you going to do about it?" "I suppose I will have to go around to her house and tell her all about it and read it to her." "Is it written so I can read it?" said Uncle Robert, glancing over the pages. "Very neat indeed. Now, I will do something for you, if you want me to save you the bother. Just to be obliging, I will take your play and go around and tell Miss Hooker that I am Rosanna's uncle and read it to her myself." "Why, you know her name," said Rosanna. Yes," said Uncle Robert. "I must have heard it somewhere. For goodness sake, Rosanna, this place is like an oven." You are red, admitted Rosanna. Well, I wish you would do that, please, because it makes me feel so queer to read it myself. It won't take you long, so we will wait up for you to tell us what she thinks. I wouldn't wait up, advised Uncle Robert, getting up. If she likes me, it may take some time. Likes you? Said Rosanna. I mean, likes the way I read it, and likes the play, and likes the idea, and everything about it, said Uncle Robert. He said goodbye and hurried off, bearing the precious paper. The girls sat and planned for a while when the doorbell rang. Rosanna could hear the distant tinkle and sang, "Perhaps he is back," and ran into the hall to look over the banisters. She returned with a surprised look on her face. "What do you suppose?" she demanded of Helen, who sat drawing a plan of a stage. "It is Uncle Robert, and Miss Hooker is with him." "Oh, dear me, I feel so fussed." "Come down," called Uncle Robert, dashing in the door. "I have a surprise for you both." "No, you haven't. I looked over the banisters," said Rosanna as the three went down the broad stairs. Miss Hooker thought the play was so good, and she was so proud to think that one of her girls had written it, that she was anxious to talk it over at once. And she asked Uncle Robert to bring her right around to see Rosanna and Helen. They all drew up around the big library table, and Uncle Robert sat next Miss Hooker, where he could make suggestions. And Miss Hooker and the girls made a list of characters and fitted them to different girls in their group. Finally, Miss Hooker said there were several places that needed a little changing. And would Rosanna trust her to do it with Mr. Horton's help? At this, Uncle Robert looked most beseechingly at Rosanna, who of course said yes. "Where will we give it?" asked Helen. "As long as it is a benefit, we want a place large enough for lots of people to come. All our families will want to come, and all the Girl Scouts families, and perhaps some other people besides." "We will give it here, won't we, Uncle Robert? Grandmother will let us, I'm sure, in the big drawing room, you know." "Not big enough," declared Uncle Robert, while both girls exclaimed. "Now, this is the part I can help about, and I have just had the great idea. You all know that big barn of Mrs. Hargrave's? We boys used to play there on rainy days when we were little. The whole top floor is one immense room. We can give our entertainment there. Mrs. Hargrave will give the barn, I know. And for my contribution, or a part of it, I will see that you have a stage and a curtain and all that." "How dear of you, Mr. Horton," said Miss Hooker. "Oh, Uncle Robert, a curtain that goes up and down?" "Of course," said Uncle Robert, "and footlights and everything." "Oh," sighed both girls, and Miss Hooker looked at Uncle Robert and smiled, and he seemed real pleased. "I think I must go if you'll be kind enough to take me home," said Miss Hooker. "Rosanna, you must tell the Girl Scouts about Gwenny at the next meeting, and read your play. Then we will get right to work, for the sooner this is staged, the better. We don't want to interfere with the Christmas work." After Mr. Horton had taken the tiny little lady home, the girls raced upstairs and went to bed. But it was a long, long time before they could get to sleep. They finally went off, however, and did not hear Uncle Robert when he came home whistling gaily. They dreamed, however, both of them, of acting before vast audiences that applauded all their speeches. And at last, Rosanna woke up with a start to find that Helen was clapping her hands furiously and stamping her feet against the footboard. After Rosanna succeeded in awakening her, they had a good laugh before they went to sleep again. At breakfast, Uncle Robert was full of plans for the benefit. "Miss Hooker and I went all over your play last night, Rosanna," he said, "and smoothed out the rough places. You know, every manuscript has to be corrected. It is on the table in my room. You had better read it over after school, and if it suits your highness, I will have it typewritten for you. And you can go ahead." I am going to see about the barn now, on my way downtown, and if Mrs. Hargraves is willing, and I am sure she will be, I will get a carpenter to measure for staging. I suppose," he added, "I ought to ask Miss Hooker to look at the place and get some suggestions from her." "Oh, I wouldn't bother to wait for her," said Rosanna, who was wild to see the stage built. "She won't care what you do. If you like, I will tell her how busy you are and that you won't bother to come around to her house anymore because you can attend to things just as well yourself." Uncle Robert looked hard at Rosanna. It was a queer look. Sort of the look you would expect from a cannibal uncle who has a little niece that he wants to eat. Rosanna, catching the look, was surprised and quite disturbed. But when Uncle Robert spoke, he merely said, "Thank you, Rosanna, but you see, I do need Miss Hooker's advice, very much indeed. The fact is, I will never be able to put this thing through as well as I want to put it through, unless I can consult with her every day or so. In fact, if I cannot consult as often as I need to, I will certainly have to give it up, and that would be awful, wouldn't it?" "Of course it would, Uncle Robert," answered Rosanna. "I just hated to have you bothered." "I will stagger along under the burden," said Uncle Robert, trying to look like a martyr. "The thing for you to do is to forget how hard I am working and how much help I have to have doing this, and get your girls to study on their parts." "Miss Hooker says I am to read it at the Scouts meeting next week, and then we will give out the parts and let them be learning them." "All right, sweetness, get after them," said Uncle Robert, kissing Rosanna and Helen too for luck, he said, and going off whistling. "I think the play is making Uncle Robert very happy," said Rosanna, as the front door slammed, and she heard a merry whistle outside. "He is a changed person these last few days." "That is what often happens," said Helen. "Probably he did not have anything to occupy his mind after business hours, so he was unhappy. Mother says it is a serious condition to allow oneself to be in. Now that he has our play to think about, he feels altogether different. I do myself. Do you know it is time to start for school? Let's be off so we won't have to worry, and we will have time to stop for Elise." Elise was ready, and the three girls sauntered down the street together. As they passed a great imposing stone house, Elise said, "It is a chateau, what you call castle, isn't it?" "Yes," said Rosanna. "And a cross old ogre lives in it. He and his sister live there all alone, with lots of maids and men to serve them. And he is so growly-wowly that Minnie says even the grocer boys are afraid of him. That is his car in front of the door. Did you ever see anything so large?" "Or so lovely," added Elise. "If he was not so what you call growly-wowly, he might carry us to school, not?" "There he comes," said Rosanna. "Does he look as though he would carry any little girls anywhere, unless he carried them off to eat?" The great carved door opened, and an old gentleman came down the steps. He walked with a cane, and to the children, he seemed very old indeed, with his snow-white hair and fierce mustache. He scowled as he came and stopped to switch with his cane at a vine that had straggled up the step. He noticed the three girls approaching and scowled at them so fiercely that they involuntarily stopped to let him pass. But he was in no hurry to do so. When he had looked them over sufficiently, he looked past them and snorted loudly at something he saw up the street. But when the girls looked about to see what was the matter, there was only a little baby girl playing with a little woolly dog, and they all looked back again at the old gentleman. He seemed to fascinate them. 3 pair of round eyes fixed on him caught the old gentleman's attention. "Well, well, well," he said testily. "What do you see? Come, come, speak out." Elise drew back, but the other two stood their ground, and Rosanna, who had seen him all her life, and was at least accustomed to him, said gently, "We see you, sir." "Hum," sputtered the old gentleman, drawing his fierce white eyebrows together. "What about me, young woman?" What about me to stare at?" Rosanna was distressed. There seemed nothing to do but tell him the truth, and that was almost too awful. She smoothed it down as well as she could. "If you will excuse me for saying so, you looked a little cross," she said. And something must be making you very unhappy." "It is," said the ogre. "It makes me unhappy to see what a silly, no-account world this is, full of small children and woolly dogs and things. Kittens, babies, chickens, bah! All making noises, all getting up at daybreak to play, meow and crow. Bah! Of course I am unhappy." He crossed the walk, waved the footman back with his cane, stepped painfully into the car, and with his own hand slammed the door shut, but his anger blinded him. He did not take his hand away soon enough, and the heavy door caught it. With a cry of pain, he dropped back on the cushions. The middle finger was crushed and bleeding profusely. "Heaven protect us!" cried Elise. The old gentleman was almost fainting. Rosanna did not hesitate. The Girl Scouts had to understand first aid. She ran up to the car and entered it, tearing up her handkerchief as she did so. Helen, close behind her, was doing the same thing with hers.